serving as branch chief in STEM training and Student Programs Directorate. And welcome to this month's Tech Talk, Invasive Species in American Waterways. Tech Talks are sponsored by the U.S. Coast Guard, Coast Guard Auxiliary, and the Sea Scout program. Tech Talks are held on the fourth Tuesday of the month at 2100 hours Eastern. That's 9 o'clock. Our next Tech Talk will be presented on February 25th by Dr. Robin Pope. The topic is first aid training for Sea Scouts and Auxiliaries, 4 skills you need and where to learn them. Just a reminder, this Tech Talk is being recorded and will be posted on both the Sea Scout and Aux Scout YouTube channels. So please subscribe to the YouTube channels and share with your shipmates that could not join in for the Tech Talk tonight. The recorded Tech Talks make excellent training for your Sea Scout ship or auxiliary flotilla. Like and subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you and your shipmates don't miss out on the excellent on-demand training. If you have questions during the Tech Talk, please type them in the Q&A box. We will address questions at the end of the presentation. Now, if you've joined us for Tech Talks before, this would be the point where I usually introduce our subject matter expert. But this evening, that will be me. I'm going to be presenting Invasive Species in American Waterways. Okay, so just a little bit about why I am interested in this topic and what I know about it. So first, I want to give full disclosure. I am not a biologist or marine biologist. I am not an ecologist. And my area of expertise, my profession by trade, is not dealing with invasive species. I am a teacher. So how did I get interested in invasive species? Particularly aquatic and marine invasive species, and why did I start studying them? Well, it's born first and foremost as a hobby and a passion of angling. I'm a fisherman. Back in high school, I also worked on a crabbing boat, and I have a waterman in the family as well, in the crabbing and oyster industry. A little later in life, I worked in summers as a seasonal park ranger for the state of Maryland, and I really got my hands dirty in that job, physically removing some invasive species from our waterways in the Chesapeake Bay and the watershed. And then in the Coast Guard Auxiliary, I pursued the path of marine safety. And a number of times I've taught a course called the Good Mate course, and it covers a wide range of topics. But one of the topics combines ecology, the ecosystem, boating, and invasive species is part of that curriculum. And so I put that all together and really developed an interest in this topic, an interest that took me to study and currently keep up with what's going on around the country with invasive species in our waterways. Oh, I should say I have this map here of the grass carp. We'll be learning a little bit about the carp and what is going on and around the country with particular species of carp, how they're invasive, how they got here, and what the problems are. And we'll be looking at a lot of different species tonight and areas all across the country. Now, I am most familiar with personal experience in the Chesapeake Bay estuary, but we'll look at invasive species and their impact all across the United States. So a very quick definition. An invasive species is an organism that is not native to a particular area. It ends up in that area, sometimes by accident, unintentionally, and sometimes on purpose. So it's a foreign species and it harms the ecosystem, right? And we'll talk about like why that is important. Something to know about invasive species. It's rapid reproduction. They are extremely adaptable, and they often lack any natural predators in their new habitat. So there's very little by way of nature to keep them in check. And we can see here 4 key species that I'll key in on tonight: the zebra mussel, the carp, the snakehead, and hydrilla. So it might seem strange, like, what is the big deal about a plant or a fish that is not from one area that ends up in an area where it is not from, where nature did not intend it to be? Well, here's some examples in the Great Lakes and the Chesapeake Bay, two areas of the country that are dealing with invasive species that wreak havoc not only on the biodiversity, but also on the economy and sometimes even the quality of life. An invasive species can absolutely transform a natural aquatic habitat. Um, for example, zebra mussels not only clog up infrastructure, pipes, and irrigation, but their own biology, how they live and function, is good in one way because it can increase water clarity, but is bad in another because it's taking in too much and producing harmful chemicals and, in effect, polluting the natural environment. Now, there's a very real cost to this. Um, the US spends over $120 billion annually, and I was doing a little more research for the last couple years, and we're up to actually about $137 billion annually to deal with the problems caused by invasive species. And that could be damage to infrastructure, such as water sources, irrigation, pipes. It can affect the properties around those bodies of water, whether it be a lake, a river, a bay. But it does a great deal of damage, the invasive species, also to the commercial fishing industry. And hopefully through the presentation tonight, you'll see some examples of what type of damage. And just as an example, in the Great Lakes region, they can lose up to $500 million a year trying to control invasive species and repair the damage that they cause. So how does a species get from one part of the world or the country where it is a naturally occurring organism, where the environment supports it and all of the other species around it, where it has natural predators, it has natural checks and balances? How does it get to a new place where that check and balance doesn't exist? Here are the primary ways, right? There's ballast water that is taken in through transport ships, the aquarium trade, and sometimes people releasing pets into the wild. If you think letting a goldfish go into a pond is not harmful, we'll see. Maybe that's not as harmless as it seems. This is a big one. Recreational activities, particularly fishing gear. And really, we can extend that to every type of recreational boating. And we'll learn a little bit more about that later. And then, unfortunately, there are sometimes intentional introductions. Sometimes the intentional introduction is for a good reason, but then there's an unintended consequence. And we'll see a few examples of that through the presentation. So here's one of the species that I had in the first collage here. It's called the snakehead fish. It's native to Asia and Africa. The type that has made its way to the United States came from Asia. On the surface level, the harm that it does, it competes with native fish for habitat. They're also voracious eaters. They're not picky either, and they have teeth. So they have very few predators, and they will eat anything from crabs to other sorts or other types of fish in the local habitat. So it disrupts the whole food web. And if you've studied food webs or food chains before, you understand how connected things are, right? The disappearance of one species can affect every level of food chain, even up to humans. They were first found in Maryland in 2002. And it's very interesting because I remember when this happened, there was a small pond in Crofton, Maryland, a little town in Anne Arundel County, behind a post office. And the fish was intentionally released just into this pond. And when the game officials found out about this fish, they actually drained the entire pond, hoping that that had solved the problem. And now between Maryland and Virginia, there are millions and millions of these snakeheads that are taking up habitat and pushing out native populations of species in the Chesapeake. They are resilient. Something interesting about the snakehead fish, it can survive on land for quite a while, right? Fish have to breathe in water, but the snakehead can survive out of water for quite a while. And their fins act sort of like legs. They can move short distances from one body of water to another. And so they become pervasive. The blue catfish, they're native to the Mississippi River Basin. That is their natural home. Also, another voracious eater that is not a very picky eater. And like the snakehead, it's a very tough fish. Not only can it's a native freshwater fish, but it can also tolerate some salinity. So when it gets into an estuary where fresh water and salt water mix to brackish, um, the blue catfish can thrive, and it eats everything in its way. Right? These blue catfish are the types that can grow up to 90 pounds to 100 pounds, right? And um, they are voracious eaters. And they were accidentally introduced into the East Coast back in the 1970s. And now they're a big problem because they are pushing out many of the native species, and it changes the whole ecosystem of rivers and estuaries. Tonight, we'll learn a little bit more about the zebra mussel. Um, they first start to appear in the Great Lakes around the 1980s. And the main problem with the zebra mussel is their proliferation. That means it starts with a few, and then there are more than you can count. And what they do is, like many mollusks, they attach themselves to infrastructure. And so any type of drainage, water pipes, right, that could be for human consumption, right? Water that comes into our houses um, from municipal water sources. They grow not only around the infrastructure, which degrades the pipes and the pumps, but they get inside as well, and they actually clog up the pipes. And another problem is they do disrupt the ecosystem. They can take in more nutrients than is healthy for the the ecosystem and the other species around it, and also produce phosphorus, which can get into our drinking water and can get into irrigation water and water for agriculture, and that will create problems. And the last of the big four is the Asian carp. Now, there are several species that I've listed. Um, these are really interesting fish. The picture I chose here shows probably one of the unique characteristics. When boats approach the Asian carp, they jump very high out of the water. And you can see that they travel in large schools. They consume huge amounts of plankton. That's the microscope, well, very tiny, and some are microscopic plants. And what that does is it throws off the oxygen balance in the ecosystem. And so if the water is not oxygenated to a certain level, there are species that are going to die off. And besides the dying off of species, then it degrades the quality of the water itself. Now, this was an intentional introduction into the United States. It was purposefully, the carp, Asian carp, was intentionally brought over to help aquaculture. So operations that farm raise fish and crustaceans and things like that. The carp are very good at keeping those enclosed marine habitats clean. They eat the algae. But the problem is the Asian carp got out of those enclosed circuits, those enclosed environments where they were doing a good job, and they got into the native or to the wild population, and it started destroying native species. And one of the plant invasives that I want to talk about tonight is hydrilla. And again, it's from Southeast Asia, and it's highly adaptable. And it started off as a decorative plant for aquariums. And the problem was people were done with their aquarium or they didn't want it anymore. And it's just a plant. So they would dump it out, right? And if it got dumped into a water source, it started to proliferate. These plants can travel not only through the water, but also through wildlife, right? Any type of waterfowl, ducks, geese, seagulls, right? They pick up parts of the living hydrilla, and when they land somewhere else, that organism has now been introduced into a new body of water. It grows super fast. It's a very rapid grower. It can grow up to an inch a day, and it creates an underwater forest, and it blocks out sunlight from reaching the different levels of the water column, and then it kills off the other native plants. Besides that, for uh, in terms, I should say, in terms of human population, they clog up the hydroelectric turbines, right? So turbines that use water to make electricity, water power, irrigation canals. And if you're a boater and you've ever come across this hydrilla, some people call it seagrass, right? You can't get your boat through it. It wraps up in the props, right? So it creates those sorts of issues. And then the last map I have over here shows, going back, about 65 years, um, where hydrilla was introduced into Florida, and you can see the red dots on how far the invasive hydrilla has traveled up and down the East Coast to the Mississippi River, down to the Gulf Coast there in Texas, and even out to California, and a few other dots around the map. So it's a really interesting phenomenon how one small plant that is dumped in one specific location that's not supposed to be there is able to proliferate across the entire country. And of course, some of these negative effects on the ecosystem, well, it alters the ecosystem, right? Once you move one little puzzle piece out of place, that ecosystem may not be able to support the rest of the life that it was designed for. And of course, especially in the realm of the fish, like the blue catfish and the snakehead, it's competition for food, but also the plants, right? Like hydrilla. It's competition with the native aquatic plants. And so it takes the resources and native species start dying off. The visualization that I have is not specifically illustrating invasive species, but it's a general decline in biodiversity since the 1970s, and it goes by continent. And so as the biodiversity decreases, we can see the percentages from 1970, I think it goes to 2014 or 2016. That's a degradation of the environment, obviously for plant and animal species, but it's also a degradation of quality of life for humans. And so the economic cost, as I mentioned, I'd come across that it costs the US about $137 billion. And when I say cost, it doesn't mean that all these costs are costs related to controlling invasive species. A lot of these costs are damages incurred, right? Damages happen to an industry like the fishing industry, and it's how much money did that industry lose due to the invasive species, right? $500 million impact on the Great Lakes. And that also translates to job loss, right? And we could think of it this way. In a particular area, if there are certain types of fish that there is a commercial industry for, so you have fleets of boats and fishermen that go out and they catch, whatever type of fish it is, and they bring it to market. And it's in grocery stores and it's in restaurants. If there are invasive species that are using up the resources, they don't have any predators, and those native species start to die out, those fish are not there for the fishermen to catch and then sell. And if they're not there to catch and sell, companies have to downsize, and some people have to sell off their business, and they're going to have to find some other way to make a living. So that's what that number reflects: 4,500 jobs lost. Right? And we can count this with tourism too. There's all sorts of tourism built around boating, water sports, and fishing. Right? So with the degradation, right, the decline of certain habitats, um, those types of industries are affected as well. Areas that may have been really good for fly fishing, where someone is, going to take a vacation to try and catch that native brook trout or the brown trout. Invasive species can degrade that ecosystem to where those native species just aren't there anymore. And it's no longer a fishing destination spot, right? So it even affects the tourism industry in that way. And the graph that I have over on the side of the screen, we see the curved area that's kind of colored in from green to red. It's showing the growth and spread of an invasive species, right? So really, we want to try and focus on the prevention. And as you can see, right, as the species exponentially grows, because every invasive species, one of their qualities is they reproduce quickly and in great number. You have to move from one step to another, right? There's eradication that is trying to get rid of that species. But once it's established, there's only two more steps: containment, which is stopping that population of the invasive species from growing. And then if it's fully established, just managing that species, right? There's no going back in time, but what can be done to manage the invasive species so that you can improve the quality of the ecosystem and try and help those native plants and native animals recover. So I spoke a little bit about, water quality, right? The degradation, the decline of the quality of the environment. And I did use the example of zebra mussels. So they can alter the water chemistry. Not only are they taking in resources that native species would normally need, but if you know anything about clams, mussels, oysters, they're filters, right? They're known for improving water quality. And that's true when they're living where they are intended to live, right? Nature is amazing on how precise organisms interact with each other to stay in balance. But we have an invasive species that is not supposed to be in a certain area, and they're proliferating in great numbers. Then it gets thrown out of bounds. So these massive quality or colonies of the zebra mussels, it looks great. The water looks crystal clear. They filter things out, right? So we look at the water and we say, wow, this is great. These zebra mussels don't seem so bad because the water looks so clean. But of course, there's many things in the water that we can't see, right? Besides taking nutrients from the other species in that ecosystem, zebra mussels release phosphorus and it contaminates the water it's in. So it's clear water, but then it's contaminated water. Zebra mussels and the other fish species we talked about, that jumping fish, the Asian carp, they eat the zooplankton, right? And they control the algae growth. And when it's in a controlled environment, say an aquaculture environment trying to raise farm-raised fish, well, that's great. It helps keep those habitats clean. But then once it's in the wild, it takes down the oxygen level of the environment. And while the carp may be able to survive, there are precise oxygen levels where other species are going to start to die off, or they're going to have to find new water and move out because they can't survive. And then once the oxygen is low enough, there is this phenomenon. It's called anaerobia. Anaerobic means low oxygen, and that triggers these algal blooms. And if you ever see an algal bloom, that's when a pond or a lake is just covered, right? It used to be clear, but now it's covered with a green slime all over the pond. Has a huge effect, particularly in agriculture, right? If any of these invasives get into water retention areas that are used for livestock, that support the meat industry, right? Um, Now you have a big problem where the water is contaminated and not usable um, for for the livestock, right? So in that sense, then the farmer suffers and the agriculture industry suffers because of the invasive species. So when I mentioned zebra mussels, they are across the country. We're trying to, we'd like to keep them where they are and not have it spread anymore as part of that containment. Where they already are, they are. But if we could stop them from spreading across the country, that would, that is the goal. The biggest problem with zebra mussels, though, is in the Great Lakes region, and the area spends about $20 million a year trying to control the zebra mussels. And we'll see one of the ways that they're trying to do containment and a little bit of eradication, trying to get rid of some of the larger colonies of zebra mussels. All right, I just wanted to show this picture of compromised infrastructure. Remember, these tiny spat, these are you can call them baby zebra mussels. They're very small. Um, they can be released and get into the pipes. And once they start to mature, they're going to create a colony inside the pipe, right? So they grow on the outside of really anything in the water. You see them, boats that have been in the water for a long time and not moved, can zebra mussels can accumulate on them. They especially like boat props. Um, they like buoys. And when you get into water supply, though, the pumps for the water, the pipes to move the water to our households, they get clogged up like this. So they either have to be removed by hand or sometimes the infrastructure has to be pulled out and completely replaced. And that is very, very expensive. So onto the Chesapeake Bay with the blue catfish and the snakehead fish. The blue catfish are now not only in the Chesapeake Bay itself, about 80% of its tributary rivers and streams. Can grow enormous. Again, they eat everything in their path. And the northern snakehead population have exploded since that first discovery in a small pond in 2002. And I think we talked about the impact, particularly in the Chesapeake region. There are study after study going on. Is it impacting the crab population? That area is known for its blue crab. Many people rely on that livelihood of either catching, selling, or restaurants preparing blue crab. And there are questions: do the catfish and the snakeheads, are they affecting the blue crab population? But here's an interesting response. As I had mentioned before, I'm a passionate fisherman, an angler. So I did throw a picture of myself in here with a Chesapeake snakehead, or a northern snakehead, properly called. And they do make excellent table fare. So that's one way in the kind of the containment and management phase, that in that state, DEM, Department of Environmental Management, is encouraging people to keep the fish. And there are actually laws surrounding this where if you're going to keep it out of the water, you cannot keep that fish alive. So they are really encouraging people to catch them and keep them. And fortunately, if you are a fish eater, they are a delicious fish. Now, the name snakehead is not a very charming or appetizing name. So there has been a campaign to rename it Chesapeake Chana. And so Chana is showing up in grocery stores and on regional menus. And so that's one way to deal with this invasive species, as well as the blue catfish, right? There are public campaigns to encourage people when they go out to eat to order either the catfish or the Chana. Now, there's a legal side um, to trying to prevent the invasive species from entering our waterways in the first place, to mitigate the damage, right? Which means to try to keep the damage to a minimum and to eradicate as well. Just have a timeline of federal level laws starting from the early 1900s. And it's a kind of a progression, right? Over time, the science behind invasive species, how they get into our waterways, how they proliferate, how to manage them changes. So, of course, the laws do change as well. But I would point to one, particularly if you are a boater, the Clean Water Act. That's one that we often bring up in boater education because it deals with a lot of aspects of boating. And one of the aspects it does deal with is invasive species management. So I do want to talk about some of the prevention strategies because that's probably our best bet, right? So public education is a prevention strategy that deals with or people's individual behaviors, a person's individual actions, and then regulations are going to be preventative measures that deal with the whole of the boating community, of recreational fishermen, um, of pet owners, of commercial shipping. So again, mitigation is trying to minimize the damage, right? Now, when I was physically removing uh, invasive plants like Phragmite and Hydrilla, I did not get to drive a specialized harvesting boat like this. Um, but that's just the nature of physical removal, right? It can be done with machine, it could be done by hand, and there are groups that will get together, whether they're paid or whether they're volunteer, and target specific areas in estuaries, on rivers, on ponds and lakes to try and physically remove some of the invasive species by hand. And government agencies, nonprofit agencies may have some equipment like the mechanical boat. Um, but then there are also other biological controls. That means that basically you have one invasive species and you think you may have a native species that could be a predator and help in basically eating up the invasive species population. So that is one strategy, but you have to be very careful because there may be unintended consequences. Just like the invasive species may have gotten here for a good reason, like the carp. It was helping the aquaculture industry. Once it was removed from that environment, it exploded, right? And no one really foresaw the unintended consequences, the amount of damage, the amount of dollars cost that the release of the carp would produce. So biological controls have to be very careful. And then there are chemical treatments, right? And herbicides would be for the kind of invasive plants like the hydrilla, um, like water chestnut, like Phragmite. They have to be EPA approved, right? They cannot that you're dealing with an invasive species that's disrupting the balance of an ecosystem. So you have to be very careful if you're using a chemical treatment. And again, this is usually left to some sort of agency, right? And for the zebra mussel, there's a copper-based solution that can kill off large colonies of them, but you can't use it in an open system where water is going to go from one location to another, because you really don't want that solution getting into anyone's drinking water or into agricultural water. So it can be tough. So as I mentioned before, releasing the goldfish, somebody has the goldfish and they say, I just don't want this pet anymore. It's a fish. I'm just going to release it into the local pond, right? Um, any invasive species, right? It's a species that does not belong there. And so the releasing of any type of pet into the wild is not good for the animal itself, and it's not good for the ecosystem. Cleaning gear. This is something that I would talk about often with boaters doing vessel examinations, vessel safety checks. Um, the phrase is clean, drain, and dry, right? People that trailer boats. Um, you want to get the boat out, and it sounds very simple, but those little bits of hydrilla could be stuck to the bottom of the boat. They could be in the bilge water. They could be in the propeller. Um, the same with, dozens of types of microorganisms, even zebra mussels, right? They could be very hard to spot. The best way to prevent the spread for boaters is a very simple process, right? Clean it, drain your water out, and let it dry. That's kind of key with this, the dry part, because we're talking about marine life, whether it's an animal or a plant. So if you dry it out, it's not going to survive, right? But say you didn't do that, right? Say a boater takes their boat out of one lake and the next day they trailer it to a different lake. Well, if there's an invasive species like hydrilla in the lake they were on the previous day, and there's little pieces stuck in the prop, right? There's, some contaminated bilge water, and they don't clean their boat, they don't drain the water, they don't let it dry completely. And then they go into they launch into lake number two the next day. Well, now those organisms are introduced into a new body of water. And so it spreads, right? Again, think about that picture I showed of the hydrilla, where in 1959, some aquarium plants were released in Florida, and now it's all over the country. Right? So a little bit can spread a long way. And this poster is from the state of Texas, warning about the dangers and the costs of the zebra mussel, right? Noting that it had been found in 8 lakes. Many of these lakes have recreational areas and like beaches, and what they do is they'll cover the area where people would go in for bathing and swimming and things like that. So it makes it a danger to the beachgoers. And of course, if there's any infrastructure in there, it can clog it up, or at best, it just grows around it, but still has to be physically removed so it doesn't compromise the integrity of any infrastructure. And then it also changes the chemistry of the water. Right. So this is a very important step: the clean, the drain, the dry. It's a simple message, but most people may not give a second thought to hitchhikers in their prop or in their bilge water or on the hull. Now, there are a few methods that are gaining popularity now. There's genetic modification, which is really interesting. So I'm not going to talk too much if you read what I have for genetic modification about CRISPR technology, but if you are interested in or know anything about the Human Genome Project, those types of genetic scientists are familiar with CRISPR, and a very simple way to explain it is um, taking selected parts of genes or DNA um, out in that field of human genetics. CRISPR technology can be used to try to treat genetic defects. Well, in the control of the invasive species, using CRISPR technology, they'll try to remove parts of the gene, the DNA of invasive species to reduce the breeding population. So in effect, the animal lives, but it will not lay eggs or it won't reproduce. Um, and it can be effective. It's very costly. So that's the downside. Another interesting method is the smart barrier. So this has taken a whole new step since the recent development of AI capabilities, because these can be electric barriers installed in waterways. It's AI powered, and the systems can detect native species versus the invasive species and put out electric pulses that will not target the native species passing through the waterway, but it will stop the targeted invasive species. Right? It won't catch every single one, and it does not electrocute them. It's like an electric fence. It's like a barrier, but it does stop many of them. Uh, so that may be the future with invasive species, particularly fish that do travel. Um, it's being tested in the Chicago River, and we'll see the lamprey coming up, and the lamprey, sea lamprey, is the target of that kind of electric fence method. Right. So again, stop the aquatic hitchhikers. It's a very simple message, but it's highly effective. Here's the sea lamprey. Um, they they are natively an ocean going fish. If you can't tell by the way it's shaped and the way that it looks, it's a bloodsucker, right? It's a parasite. It attaches to other fish. It particularly likes species of trout. And since the early 1900s, they made their way from the ocean to Niagara Falls. And that used to be a native barrier. It was just a natural barrier. They couldn't spread any further. But in that time period, the country started building more canals in conjunction with serving the railroads. And the canals would connect rivers across the country. And as canals were built, so went the sea lamprey. The main damage the lamprey causes is to the fishing industry. It almost decimated, almost wiped out the fishing industry in the Great Lakes region. But this is one of the success stories, right? Some of these efforts that I've been talking about on, well, how do we mitigate, how do we control invasive species and stop them from doing the damage that they are capable of? The sea lamprey is one of the success stories. And again, these electric barriers, AI-driven electronic barriers, are being used to particularly target the sea lampreys. Um, Not an aquatic example, but land mammal example. Australia, for about a century, had a problem with rabbits, which might not seem like a big threat, but they were causing several hundred millions of dollars of crop damage every year, right? So Australia has a model of tracking and containment that has greatly reduced the damage that the rabbits can do. New Zealand is kind of a benchmark country for their maritime biosecurity measures, and um, it's something that the world has taken on, and most countries are participating now in similar kind of measures with commercial shipping. It mostly has to do with ballast water, because ships that are constantly going from port to port are picking up organisms from all over the world. And as they empty their ballast water, those organisms are being dropped into a new environment. And as we saw with the sea lamprey, just because it's in the ocean does not guarantee it cannot make it and thrive into freshwater sources and cause physical damage, ecological damage, and economic damage. Figuring out exactly where and how many invasive species are is can be a little tricky. Um, One of the newer methods is eDNA technology. E is just stand for environmental DNA. So this is not extracting DNA from a fish or from a plant. Um, a biologist, marine biologist, can take a water sample and there will be eDNA all through that sample, and they'll be able to identify dozens, if not hundreds, of species that live in that ecosystem. So if there's a question of has this area been infested with an invasive species or not, eDNA is one way to test that. You can test the water, you can test mud and silt, and then you can target it. And then there'll be concentration levels, which will tell give a little picture of how widespread the species might be in that area. And then drone technology for monitoring. It can be imaging, tracking, and a very helpful tool, particularly if you're talking aquatic plants, invasive species like the hydrilla. And there's a side that is non-scientific, non-technical, and that would be the policy side, right? Um, there are nonprofits and government agencies that are dedicated to mitigating, controlling, and trying to eradicate some invasive species across the country. And those types of organizations are crucial in developing the types of laws and policies that are going to help keep our waterways healthy. So again, I just wanted to show the zebra mussel, the Asian carp, the snakehead there on land, and hydrilla, right? And the industries that can be affected, right? From agriculture to fisheries, tourism, and infrastructure, particularly to our water delivery systems. Now, there are invasive species across the country, but here are some hot spots that are trying to mitigate some of the biggest problems that we spoke about tonight, the Great Lakes and the Chesapeake Bay. And I thought I would throw one in here too. This goes with don't release pets. Many people are aware of the pythons in the Everglades down in Florida. So here we have a wildlife officer with one of the snakes, and they're causing all sorts of damage to the natural ecosystem of the Everglades, as well as a danger to human tourists. Right, the Burmese python has been released, and it's still an issue where people take on a snake as a pet. The python gets much larger than expected, and they dump them off into the Everglades where they thrive and reproduce. As far as commercial shipping and container ships, go back, the big issue here is ballast water. There's an exchange of water, and there can be organisms from one part of the world that are dumped off in another part of the world where they are not supposed to be, and they could become an invasive species, competing for resources and causing damage. I just want to mention a few apps. How can we help as individuals if you're interested in this subject? One of the best ones out there is iNaturalist, because it reports species sightings. The Invasive Plant Atlas is a volunteer mapping program. Again, you can report species, as well as Wild Spotter. So any of those three you can find very easily. If you're interested in using an app, they all three have websites as well that you can go to. But these are things that you can download on your smartphone. And even if you're in an area where that there are invasive species like the snakehead, the blue catfish, zebra mussels, it's still helpful to report and log those, right? Because it helps the organizations that have the means to try and mitigate those species. It helps them keep track of spread, growth, and then in some cases, decline. Where are the efforts working? Right, a few pictures of successes here. You see the hydrilla removal, Chachilla River. That's tributary to the San Joaquin in Central California, from clogged up with hydrilla to clear river. As river across the country, as river ecosystems are restored and invasive species aren't competing for resources or eating up baby trout, you get the native brook trout coming back. And we have a picture of a wetlands restoration project, basically a dying wetland to a healthy, thriving wetland. And some of the other uh, technologies that are just really starting. We talked a little bit about gene editing with the CRISPR technology, um, and then autonomous removal that could be the linked with the AI-driven electric fences and satellite monitoring to get real-time data. And so it comes down to, um, our part, right? Stay informed. So find out what invasive species are a threat to your area, right? If you don't know what's a threat, one of the great places to start is the National Wildlife Service. And any of those apps that I had mentioned, you can figure out, what is a threat to your local ecosystem. Using those types of apps report your sightings, right? If you have a chance to speak up to support for policies to protect our waterways. And then if you see an opportunity or hear about an opportunity to join in an effort to clean up the waterways, or physically remove Phragmites or hydrilla, it can be a fun way to help with the problem. I won't go through these, but I did list my references. These are all hyperlinked to where I got my information. And then there's the last little bit are, what are some careers or things that I could study if I'm, interested in helping determine where invasive species are, how to mitigate them, right? So the obvious one might be ecologist or biologist, but of course there are wildlife managers, wildlife officers. Every state has some sort of wildlife or game law enforcement program, marine conservationists, um, outside of the field, right? You can have a background in law, you can have a background in policy, project management, and get into the rulemaking side um, of things. And of course, you could be an educator. Um, there's a spot for engineers, um, the invasive species specialists that are out there in the field and typically are are not typically crucial to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, trying to keep our food sources um, safe and robust. And then geographic information system specialists, right? Mapping data, tracking where the invasive species are, and tracking the trends. Are the efforts working? So that is everything I wanted to share with you tonight about invasive species. I will stop sharing my screen now. Okay. So again, um, I'm not a biologist or an ecologist, but over the years I have developed an interest and try to keep up with what areas of the country are experiencing problems by invasive species. And I do my part as a fisherman, and I will try to target those invasive species.
PJ, a couple questions have come in, uh, and one of them is what current government programs, if any, are used to control these invasive fish?
So there are control programs, usually at least two levels of government. So Each state, it would be state specific. So I can't speak for all 50 states, but in Maryland, it would be DEM. DEM is not only monitors but tries to remove um, invasive species, whether that's plants like Phragmites, hydrilla, or fish. Um, and at the state level, they will run programs where it's not the actual park ranger that is out there removing the native species, but they'll run a program like a fishing tournament and say, we are targeting this invasive species, right? So there's prize money and everything else. And what that's supposed to do is to drum up interest in catching the invasive to get more of them out of the environment. At the federal level, it's the National Wildlife Service is the main government agency. Um, but then there are a lot of nonprofits, which are not government programs, um, but they exist in a nonprofit status to either directly pay for equipment and people to go remediate areas that have an invasive species problem, or they are paying for the research. So a lot of these, whether it's a college or university or a nonprofit, will use that type of money for mostly biological research and then technological research to develop new tools like the AI driven electrolysis.
All right. And another question, what efforts does the Coast Guard do to control invasive species?
So it's mostly regulatory. The Coast Guard has authority in all ports in the United States, and so that's all laws applying to shipping and U.S. waters. So any regulations that have to do with issues I brought up tonight, such as ballast water, cleaning the water, disposal, and storage, the Coast Guard will be checking that to make sure that commercial ships are doing that properly, and then addressing any violations, right? That could be a violation of federal and sometimes international law. The Coast Guard also does it through education, right? By talking with boaters. I know, in our part of the Coast Guard and the auxiliary, we often are talking with boaters at the boat ramp and during vessel safety checks. And that's a time where we're talking to them about the clean, drain, and dry, right? We tell them hydrilla, what is the zebra mussel? What kind of problems do they cause? And a lot of times people don't know that they do cause problems. So we tell them about that and what they can do with their boat and their fishing gear to make sure they're not going to be part of the problem, that they're not going to spread any of those invasive species anywhere else. And then the last thing is, enforcing fishery laws, right? So it's a lot of law enforcement.
All right. Thank you, PJ. It was very informative. Thank you very much. We learned a lot tonight.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. We hope to see you again on February 25th for our next Tech Talk with Dr. Robin Pope, who will be uh, telling us all about first aid training opportunities for Sea Scouts and auxiliaries, the core skills we need and where we can learn them. Have a good night, everyone.